Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our very first virtual CEO Leadership Institute. It is wonderful to be able to welcome everyone back. Thankful for the technology that allows us to be together, even at a time where we really have been apart, both physically as well as with regard to the summer. I want to give a big shout out to Principal Monique Dubai, who is hosting today at Fort Worthington Elementary Middle School. It's good to be back in classroom space, but I will tell you, it is surreal to not have the flow and the ebb and the buzz that's here. But know that even though that buzz is not live, I know that so many of you have already been a buzz, getting ready for the reopening of school. School is not closed. School will be opening up. We'll just be opening up in a different way. And so today I just want to spend a little bit of time really getting us centered as a district, as a community around where we are in beginning to set the table and prepare for the return of school, the return of families, and the return of young people in a virtual space. So as we get started, one of the things that I think is important for us to keep in mind is that we absolutely have been in a swirl, myself included. The combination of an unprecedented health crisis, the most recent racial uprisings in our country have just compounded a sense of kind of civic distrust, upheaval, shift, and change. The challenge within all of that is finding the center, finding the core that enables us to, in the midst of all that is going on around us, not like the pessimists say, this just is the wind is too much and it's overflowing, or even like the optimists to just say, oh, it'll all get better soon. We found out very quickly that it wouldn't. But actually, as we navigate this space and time, really reminding ourselves of what it is that is our center. And what's interesting about this is when I left for vacation, and it wasn't vacation as I had anticipated it would be, and as many of you know, I like to kind of reference back to my time away. But my time away this year felt differently and was different than what we had planned, right? So there was no kind of grand vacation and tours around someplace. It actually, for me, was just being able to go home, quarantining for 14 days so that I would be able to see my 80-plus-year-old parents. My dad's 82 and my mom is 81. And being able with their grandchildren and my husband to be able to actually spend time together was really going to be the peak of our summer. So we quarantined for 14 days and didn't realize, like I think a lot of you, just how much kind of the stress of spring, the stress of planning had been weighing me down, because we are people who just continue to go. We go regardless, we get the work done. And it wasn't until I actually landed back home, right, that the simple things really gave me a clarity that I hadn't seen before. Because in the swirl, what I realized was that the clarity came from the relationships. It came from being able to connect in simple ways. Now, I had told the girls, my husband and I had told the girls, like, don't be expecting a whole lot of big trips to amusement parks and here and there. We were incredibly blessed that we were like one of only the first 100 families to be allowed back into the Boston Museum of Science, which was huge for us because we actually got to go out. But what's funny, and what you can see in some of the pictures, is most of the time was just spent around the house. Most of the time was spent at the beach, with family, with people that we knew. And during that time, what was interesting is I watched my children, like we watch city schools children, that some of that pressure that also had transferred to them also began to kind of melt away. And it didn't require a grand European vacation. It didn't require a week at Disney World. What allowed a lot of that stress and tension, and part of why I put the picture up of the three of them smiling, I think that was one of the first times I had seen a completely relaxed smile on my three girls' face. And it was because of the connections. And when I talked to them about it, it was the fact that being back with Nana and Grandpa, which in our family was a big deal, was a reassurance that some things don't change in the midst of everything else that's going around and around us. And that the anchor of being with people who they knew were feeding into them, who believed in them, who had memories and activated those memories, right, were part of what actually yielded those smiles, right? So it wasn't that they had some big grand tour. It was this feeling that I actually began to feel as well. So a trip away that was supposed to be, and Jenny and Christy could tell you, it was supposed to be 7 days because I was like, I'm just going to be in and out, turned into 10 days, turned into 2 weeks. And yes, I did take board calls and all of that while I was away. But what began happening was the reconnection and the ability to solidify relationships is what actually, I love being back in real school, what actually gave us the ability to recharge and reset for, quite frankly, a world that we don't have definitive answers for. And this is probably one of the first times, I think, in my 4 years that I remember where we don't have everything set for beginning of school that allows us to rely on the routines, the past practices that we've done. We've had to switch all of that. But what we do have, what we do still have, is the ability to connect with one another in ways that allow us to navigate new territory and a shifting ground. So one of the things that also became very clear to me as we were spending time home is that there is this definition, the power of affirmation that Zaretta Hammond, and for those of you who have not read, I know many of you have, her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, and she does an absolutely masterful job of connecting what we know about brain research to culturally responsive teaching. And this definition of affirmation is me from my children, from my family during that reconnection. And affirmation is basically saying, in word and deed, I care about you, right? And I care about you, I care about how you are doing. And one of the things that that Zaretta Hammond says, when you get to this part of her book, is that be careful not to confuse affirmation with self-esteem. Because oftentimes what we see with children of color, what we see with children from low income and under-resourced communities is we come oftentimes as educators with this idea that they need their self-esteem boosted. But actually, for many of them, they actually come to school with families who have already boosted their self-esteem. The challenge many of them face is when they enter the institution of school, that self-esteem is not verified and expanded upon with affirmation. So part of what produced those smiles on my girl's faces was this idea of affirmation. And a lot of what we did on a dime, turning on a dime, very quickly, with no notice this spring, was really moving towards affirmation. And we've talked before about how just the yeoman's work that this school district did, that many leaders, teachers, central office folks, bus drivers, food and nutrition workers did to make sure that our young people and our families in the early days of this crisis were touched and verified. And so part of that, when we actually began looking at some of the early data, some of what we saw were schools like the ones listed here who regularly engaged students, 95% or more of students at K through 8, with 2 or more engagements for 7 consecutive weeks this spring. Now, I will tell you, a lot of the data is imperfect. It was put together. It was made with spreadsheets. It will look different this fall because now we'll have a platform and we'll have it set up to actually capture some of those engagements in different ways. But again, on a dime, we had schools who actually, with no notice, were able to connect with and engage with young people and their families at least twice a week with, again, no notice. We also saw at the high school level, we had schools that regularly engaged with 85% more of students with the same criteria. And so this massive undertaking this spring was the quick, instinctive response that we all had to make sure that our families were touched, that our families were cared for. That was the starting line. What I offer today, though, is the goal that our target has shifted. That now with intentionality, we are building relationships that actually have multiple purposes. The first is absolutely affirmation. But another important connection is affirmation and relationships for the purpose of connecting children to learning, making sure that students are, yes, connected to, yes, affirmed, yes, supported, but it is not an either or. It is a but and. And so part of why I like this Tanji Reed Marshall quote, and Tanji works with Education Trust, with my former employer, it seems like 100 years ago. But Tanji Reed Marshall is a team member at Ed Trust, and what I love about this quote from her, and we did do a little Twitter cleanup because you only get a certain number of characters, so I just want you to know that's what the cleanup was. But one of the things that Dr. Marshall references, particularly with issues of equity, is to make sure that we are not just saying that the touches twice a week, checking in, is enough. That actually for the children we serve, it has to be a both and. And we can't allow others to set the bar as an either or. As we either or are just attending to the emotional needs, the impacts of trauma, or we do school. That with our young people, it has to be about making sure that we are continuing the connections, we're doing a better, deeper job of those connections, as well as using those connections to make sure that young people who were underserved by schooling prior to the pandemic are not once again left behind with only half of the equation. So again, it's a both and, It's not an either or. And I want for just 1 minute us to reconnect, and actually be 4 minutes, with what parents, what families were experiencing prior to the pandemic. Because the reality is that in this new space that we are in, we have to be sure to attune our ears to many families across the country and specifically in Baltimore who are saying to us, we weren't totally sure our young people were getting what they needed before. How are you going to guarantee us that they're going to get what they need now? And that requires just to step back. And part of why this piece, and it's a piece on Emily Hanford's podcast. It's a recent one. This was a couple of weeks ago. But part of why I wanted to use this piece is because it's coming from the voice of parents. It's coming from the voice of the people who we said we valued in everyday schooling, but they are now the people in a virtual environment that we are going to be absolutely dependent on to support the work of teaching and learning in ways we have not asked them to do before. So I ask that you tune your ears in. This is about probably 8 minutes into the broadcast, but again, I want you to hear the experience, not through the voice of our colleagues, not through the voice of others looking in, but through a parent and her experiences.
Sonia says many parents don't realize how far behind their kids are.
They don't know that their children are not reading at grade level, and their children truly don't know how to read. They don't know until it costs them.
This is what happened with her youngest son, CJ. The story starts in first grade.
I knew something was going on with him, but I could not figure it out.
He just didn't seem to be getting it when it came to reading. The school said he was behind, but nothing to worry about. They were giving him extra help.
There was never a conversation of he's struggling with reading. It's he needs some intervention, so we're gonna take him out of class, read with him a little more. I'm like, okay, great, good,
She asked what she should be doing at home, and the answer was read to him. She did, says she always had. But things didn't seem to be getting better. Second grade, third grade, fourth grade, Sonia was really worried. But the school said he was making progress.
He did okay, but I just knew that he wasn't doing as well as my other kids. So I started asking myself, does he have a learning disability?
She asked for CJ to be tested, but the school said no need, he was fine. She didn't know what to do. Tutoring, private school, those weren't things she could afford. She was desperate, and she knew something about how CJ felt. She had a hard time learning to read, and she says no one helped her.
I don't remember being taught to read.
She just remembers being expected to know how to do it. As she got older, she says her problem wasn't that she couldn't read the words. It's that she didn't know what a lot of the words meant.
Because if I would read a sentence or read a passage, I'm like, okay, what did that mean?
She says she was rarely assigned to read anything in school except stuff in textbooks.
No books, no novels, no any of that. Like, I did not read books until I actually got in high school in my English class and we read Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit 451, the 1950s dystopian novel by Ray Bradbury.
I hated that book because that book was hard. I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the understanding. It talked around a whole bunch of things, and I just did not understand. I could never make the connection, and so I struggled.
It wasn't just that words stumped her when she was reading. Words sometimes stumped her when people were talking, too. She noticed it at work in the healthcare industry.
I mean, I work in a corporate world, and I could tell sometimes when they would have conversations, I didn't know what they were talking about, and I would find myself Googling words.
It was embarrassing. She did not want this to happen to her son. But the schools kept telling her not to worry. His grades were good. He was a well-behaved kid. And then 7th grade. CJ had moved to a new school. It was September. CJ's advisor called Sonia in for a meeting.
And the advisor says that he's on task. He has turned in all his assignments. I'm like, yeah, I know. She said, but when we tested him, he reads on a 2nd grade reading level. I lost it. It felt like I cried for 15 minutes. I sobbed.
Eventually, she wiped the tears from her face, put her glasses back on, and looked up. The advisor told her the school would help CJ. Sonia wanted to believe it, but she'd been putting her faith in the school system for years, and this is where it had gotten her, a son in 7th grade at a 2nd grade reading level.
And it was from that day on, I said, nobody else should walk away feeling like that. No child, no mama, no daddy. Like, it's my life's work to make sure nobody else feels like that.
That was when she helped start the parent group, Propel.
I love what they do.
This is Visha Hawkins again, the former school system insider. When she met the parents of Propel, she realized she was finally talking to the people she needed to hear. All those educators she'd had coffee with, they blamed poverty for the city's reading crisis and made it sound so unsolvable. But after listening to parents like Sonia Thomas, it all seemed much more urgent and clear.
We should be able to expect that a kid goes to school and learn to read, if nothing else.
And learn to read, if nothing else. So when we look at the frame of our work now and navigating shifts and why the relationships are important, we can't separate that from the actual work of schools to educate young people. Because one of the things, and I remember sitting actually in my bed and listening to this piece for the first time and crying and being angry. Because within the context of that brief moment in the interview, what becomes apparent is that it's not just Sonia's child. Now, the irony of sharing a name with the parent was not missed by me. And the fact that the name Sonia means wisdom, and that I had somebody else with my name that means wisdom, that actually did not see herself in that light because of the missed work of our schools, because this was in Tennessee, but let's be clear, there are these stories repeated over and over again within Baltimore City. And what that realization brought me to is that we actually have an opportunity within the current context, with all that's going on, with all of the challenges, to not just revert to a poverty narrative. We have actually the opportunity to connect with families, to affirm young people as who they are, and the power and the beauty of that through our action and our deed, and to connect it to tools that will actually break generational experiences like the one we just heard. So, a couple quick data points about the story that is beginning to form. As you look, sixth grade math performance based on a comparison of typical rates of learning of students in class. And you'll see that based on a change, that trajectory change, based on which scenario of in-class schooling as opposed to virtual schooling occurs. So in scenario one, it would be a return to class in schooling in fall of 2020. Now, we know in Baltimore City, that's not occurring. So if we move to scenario two, right, which many of our school districts have already shifted to, what we'll see is a return to in-class schooling in January 2021. And the scenario that we don't want to talk about, but absolutely could be the case, is that we don't return to in-class schooling until fall 2021. So when we look at this, what we'll see are the different color bars reflect what the learning loss or the learning trajectory would look like for students experiencing average quality remote learning. Then we'll see in the first blue line what the learning slowdown for low quality remote learning, the second blue line, low quality remote learning. And the last one would be learning loss with no instruction. And when we say no instruction, those are the young people who don't get the touches. Those are the young people without the Chromebooks. Those are the young people that go, quote, off the grid. So as we move forward, what you'll see from those charts, and again, this is projected, that just average remote learning has a projected learning loss of 3 to 4 months as compared to typical in-classroom learning. Low quality remote learning is projected to yield anywhere from 7 to 11 months. And keep in mind, we don't have an 11-month school year. That's what's frightening. A 7 to 11-month learning loss. And then no instruction is a year to 14 months. So those are projections based on what we currently know about past performance of students and comparing that to projections based on what we have learned about what happens, for example, in natural disasters like Katrina, what we know happens when young people are in countries that experience war or civil unrest. And so if we were to simulate learning loss in those conditions, this is the impact. So when we talk about connecting students, when we talk about making sure every student has a Chromebook, when we talk about making sure, right, that young people are getting touched every day by caring adults, it's this story that we are working to change. Because I will tell you, the predictions, the projections, to no one's surprise, I'm sure, if we look at the impact based on income and racial ethnic group, continue to show the same gaps that we unfortunately too often occur as we even do in classroom learning. What it's showing, though, is that disproportionately this challenge for schooling is disproportionately impacting the young people whom we serve in Baltimore City. But again, what I would say on this is that these are projections. These are projections. They are not final declarations. And so as we look to this idea, right, of culturally responsive teaching, one of the things that I would say is that, and part of why, again, I love this Zaretta Hammond quote, is it's not just about connecting with young people so they feel good. It's about connecting with young people and families so that the learning process is an empowering one and one that gives them the tools to make the decisions about their own lives in ways that positively impact them and our larger Baltimore community. So as we look to the work that we have to do in front of us, the other question that arises for me is, so where are we actually seeing the seeds within the work that we have done this far, that many of you have helped to lift? Where do we see the seeds that actually can help shift a story, change the ending, so that the projections that we just reviewed are not final destiny, but those projections are really a warning. They're a warning of, if we don't begin to iterate and change the way we need to, we know what the end of the story will be. But we also have seeds within the work we have done already in Baltimore City of what could possibly be a very, very different story. And I would like to tell some of those stories through some of the eyes of our students and students who have already benefited in tangible ways from adults who made caring connection and affirmations that actually then led to tangible academic outcomes that will change, because we know that high school graduation actually changes lifetime earnings and income potential. It changes an individual's ability to even qualify to do kind of additional schooling. And so some of our own students have already benefited from the work that we've done to make sure that those McKinsey projections are not realized. So first, we have Kiwan Woogie, AKA Woogie, and one of the things, and when I asked staff for the profile of Woogie, one of the things they said was that Kiwan beamed as he spoke about receiving his diploma. "I just want to frame it for my dad," he said. A gifted poet, who many know simply as Woogie, Kiwan traveled a bumpy path to that diploma, often having to juggle work and school to help support his family and an ill parent. A credit shy of graduating this spring, the clock was ticking on the 21-year-old when he enrolled in the hybrid summer school at the Re-Engagement Center. There, working closely with his teacher, Mr. Stasio, and then logging back in late into the night, unit by unit, Kiwan made his way through. At 6:17 a.m. in the morning on the deadline day for completion, the text came in from a sleep-deprived Mr. Stasio. Kiwan had done it. Quote, "I can't believe I made it. I did it. I'm proud." Next, we have Kaya. Kaya is a student at Career Academy. She was one credit short of graduating when Kaya enrolled in the hybrid summer school at the Re-Engagement Center. Throughout the COVID closures, she had struggled to access online learning and reliable internet connection, and was finding it hard to focus without the stability of having a school to go to every day. At the Re-Engagement Center, she met her English teacher, Ms. Kemp, who worked with her for hours one-on-one, and it paid off. The night before the deadline, Kaya and Ms. Kemp stayed in the classroom long after hours. At 7:30 p.m., the cheers rang out from that classroom as Atiri Kaya learned she had finally done it. "It took me so long to get here," she said, wiping red eyes. "But I'm graduating." And then we have Montel. On the last day of hybrid summer school at the Re-Engagement Center, the frantic call came into school lead, Mrs. Manganan. After weeks of hard work, Montel had raced over on his bike to complete his last units, had forgotten his mask, and was worried he wouldn't be allowed to finish. He had worked too hard and come through too much to stop short of his goal. Ms. Manganan was not about to let a mask stand between Montel and graduation. So she met him in the parking lot with a mask he could wear and ushered him in. There, he worked with her and his teachers late into the evening until the moment they placed a grad cap fashioned out of folders and Scotch tape, I think you can probably see it, over his beaming face. A fresh graduate, Montel is now preparing to enroll with Grad to Careers to pursue a career in healthcare. Quote, "There are so many things I want to do. Now I know I can." And then finally, Eli. A BSA student and gifted dancer, Eli had received an opportunity he couldn't pass up, the chance to dance professionally with a company in New York City. It was his dream come true, but it meant that he had to put his high school education on hold, just 4 credits short of graduation. This summer, Eli returned to Baltimore, determined to earn his diploma. He enrolled in the hybrid summer program at the Re-Engagement Center, where he put in long hours each day, working closely with his teacher, only breaking to point and flex his dancer's feet, as his teachers provided him academic support and feedback. And all the work and support paid off. Not only will those feet grace the New York City stages, but they will also tap across the graduation stage. Those are our students. Those are our young people. Those are our teachers, our staff. Those stories are Baltimore City stories. Those are stories of what we do and can do when we are focused on the engaging, the affirmation, and the connection to learning that so many of our young people need. So one of the things that was true this past spring was that families absolutely, as I've said earlier, appreciated all of the lift that we did as city schools. What was also clear in survey after survey of parents was that they also knew that there was something else they wanted. And we heard overwhelmingly from parents and families that they want a different experience for their young people this school year. They want more enriching learning opportunities, more time with their students and teachers, and when possible, in small groups, families showed us that some of them really do want time for their young people to have the kind of in-person learning in safe environment that allows their young people to not only catch up, but to thrive. And so, when we look even at some of our early family survey results, and we partnered with an outside organization to make sure that they could begin to collect data. And I want to point out again that a lot of the data you're seeing now is baseline data that we will be following throughout the course of the school year. So we will, every 4 to 6 weeks, be surveying parents about the quality of their learning, remote learning experience for their students, so that we have both district level feedback and data, as well as any data that will be collected at the school level. And by that I mean just the administrators and teachers who on their own want to find out. We will be doing some of that district-wide as well. So a sample of one question is, how satisfied are you with your child's distant learning experience this spring? So that will be a question that we will ask through the fall. A couple of shout-outs here. These were schools in which families responded favorably to this question. Now, I just want everybody to know, I know not everybody's families weighed in the same way. Again, this is benchmark data, but I do think what's important is to note that even in the spring, we began to see, again, examples in district of schools that were beginning to move in ways that families could say, my child had a favorable distance learning experience. And what that does is it builds a pattern of trust. We are building trust. Many of you are continuing trust between families and school. So shout out to these schools. Another question or another survey response. My child's school communicated clear expectations for distance learning. So at a very basic level, are families and students clear about what the expectations will be? Now we know over the upcoming weeks, a lot of what we've already put out centrally will be teased through with schools at the school level. How that gets communicated is definitely connected to how students and families experience, right, this new learning context. Another question, shout out to these schools. How frequently did teachers interact with you or your child during this distance learning period? So this was something that we heard, something even I experienced as a parent. And again, we knew it was emergency. We knew it was turn on a dime. But as we move into the fall, this focus on how do we make sure that there are deliberate, repeated contacts and connections between students and teachers. Because that interaction, while it won't be the entire time, is an important part of each day. Parents feel it, students feel it, and shout out again to some of our schools who already experienced positive feedback to build on from their families. And then finally, how often did teachers discuss your child's learning or progress with you during the distance learning period? Now, what's interesting about this question, and again, shout out to the schools here that already, again, have some seeds of success to build on. One thing I want to point out that we continued to hear from families was the overwhelming appreciation for touches and making sure everyone was okay. But there was also a definite distinction between a check-in to say, how you doing today, Sonia? How are you feeling? And how's that reading coming? Where are we with your math? Connecting with grandma or auntie or uncle or dad to be able to say, right, what Sonia in her earlier comments on the podcast was saying was, what does that communication look like around my child's progress? Because what we know is that families in every neighborhood in the city of Baltimore are concerned about their child's academic process and progress. And so part of one of the wonderful learnings, and I think it was the team at Thomas Jefferson, hopefully I'm right on this, and I was sharing, the principal, I think, was sharing, might have even been on social media or a different forum, that a lot of the teachers actually were brave enough to share that one of their biggest learnings during the spring challenge was that families actually do care, and more families care in deeper ways than we had previously seen. And it was the crisis that allowed them to see with a different level of depth the care and concern. And so it's not just parents in my zip code. It's parents in every zip code in our city who care about the progress of their children. And so part of why we will be continuing to ask this question throughout the fall is because, again, we're doing this affirmation and this connecting for a purpose. It's not just connecting to say that I connected. It's connecting and caring so that then I have built up the trust that you also, as a school system, care about my child's progress, even in the midst of the swirl. So, a couple more shout outs that I would like to take some time to do. And again, just know, and I know I always get little texts from folks about what they were doing and all of this. This is not to say these folks exclusively, but I would like to shout out 3 school leaders this summer who took their learning from the spring and actually pushed through some of their own fears. And let me be clear, the fears about the virus are real and not to be dismissed. I will say that we also had leaders this summer who were willing to apply their diligence, apply their attention to actually making sure that some of our most vulnerable young people, those who did not connect in the spring, those, many of whom have learning disabilities, some who are English language learners, and they're embodied in people like, for example, Principal Monique DeBay, whose school, she didn't know I was going to include her today. And it's not just because we're sitting at a school. But Principal DeBay is what I call a skeptical consumer principal. She doesn't just take stuff that comes down the pike and say, I'm just going to do this. She asks questions. She pushes. She wants to make sure what is necessary is in place. It's funny because she's been looking at me now. Now she's not looking at me anymore. And in the end, despite her own concern, and again, rightly so around the house, she made sure that not only was everything in place, from social distancing to making sure the temperature checks, making sure all the protocols were followed in terms of cleaning and sanitizing, but in the process of that, they brought small groups of students back in ways that both staff and she and families were comfortable. They didn't have hallways like the ones you see in Dallas with 100 children falling through the hallway. But they did that to be able to touch the young people who they knew had not connected. And one of the things that she told me this morning, so hearkening back to the CJ story, is that one of their 5th graders who had not been reading, whose mom, I believe it was mom, knew that her baby could not read and was concerned because any mom of a 5th grader whose child is struggling reading has every right to be concerned. That student was identified for the summer learning experience, and at the end of the summer was a far more stable reader and closer to grade level, correct, than had occurred previously. There are also stories, right, of principals like Sandra Worthy Owens, who literally went door to door door to door, not just recruiting, but connecting with families to let them know your child is seen, your child is heard, your child is known, and we are providing a safe space for them to connect. And then we had Principal Pratt, who in Sandtown, Winchester, made sure that she worked with our special education team centrally to identify those students with disabilities that she knew had missed services during the spring, and those students were prioritized. And again, in small groups, 5 or 6, brought them in. So when we're sitting and we're thinking and reflecting, right, some of this will be in person. Some of this will be doing what a lot of our partners did. And so we had partners like Ron Hamilton with the movement team, Derek Deramis, also with the movement team partnership, and others. Eben Draper, a concentric partner. These are all people, some of our school social workers. So the social worker, Christina Lucas at the Re-Engagement Center. We also had the social worker, Kenya Tucker at Hampstead Hill. Others who were part of teams who went out and found children and families who had previously, as I like to call, gone off the grid, who because of distance learning, because of other pressures, were hidden, were disconnected. And these are individuals, along with the principals I named and others, who have spent time going out, finding, making the connections, and reconnecting in ways that have academic impact. Again, it's a both and. It's not an either or. It's not just academics without relationship, because you have no academics if you have relationship. Or I should say, you only have academics, you don't have learning if you don't have relationship. And so it's this both and. And it's also the teachers who have spent time this summer in virtual space, revamping the way that we do our work in virtual space based on the successes they had in the spring. So we have Kier Butts, we have Ms. Fort, who spent time this summer thinking through virtual learning in new ways, who used virtual space in ways that connect with students, connect them back to learning. Again, not an either or. So the space where we are now, I would argue, is a space where we actually have to have innovation that emerges through actual community of ideas. And what's interesting about this Megan Gambino quote is that it actually refers to a big kind of PBS series, I think, that came out in, I believe it was 2014, about innovations. And about innovations throughout history, right? How the invention of the printing press actually drove, believe it or not, the eyeglass industry, the emergence of the eyeglass industry, because once people had text, they actually needed to be able to read and realize that their vision was insufficient for that, right? So not an initial connection that we would have thought would come from the invention of the printing press. But one of the pieces that she references in this is a shift in how we understand genius. And that often in Western culture, genius is seen as an individual trait. This person is a genius. This person is really smart. And it comes as kind of this fixed determinant of an individual. And one of the things that comes out in the series and in the study that I think is particularly profound is this idea that actually it is the genius of networks that is the true genius that changes, right, how we go about life as we know it. That if you look at the development, for example, of Thomas Edison, who we give credit for the light bulb, right? So we say Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. But what we don't say, what we don't talk about, are all the iterations of various facets of the light bulb that led to that final invention that's marked in history. There's actually about 20 inventions prior to the light bulb that enabled Thomas Edison to put them together. Had those inventions not taken place, the light bulb would not have been in existence at the time it was, had the innovations not happened prior to that. So when I think about where we are now in this, the question becomes, what are the innovations that have been successful? Now, it's not innovating for the sake of innovating, but it is innovating knowing that there's a small success here. How do we iterate on that as a community, not as an individual, and actually scale that up? Now, part of what is challenging in doing that, which I hear all the time from principals, from teachers, is these kind of outside regulations that we have to follow, right? Like one of the big pressure points is seat time. And how do we make sure that there's enough time, right, that's docked and documented, and that's driven by a particular frame. But we also have schools, we have principals that have thought about how, even within that constraint, to begin to push the boundaries. And you heard about some of those even within the re-engagement center stories, right? So what does it look like to record a lesson so that a young person, so that a high school student that's working can actually go back and access that lesson later? What does it look like to actually have a day of the week, which we took based on feedback from our high schools, to have a day of the week that is about connecting one-on-one with students in small groups of students? And I would argue that part of the convincing, when that proposal was brought to me, came because of the seeds of success that had been planted in other areas of our on-track work, of our counseling work, right, of our teacher touch to students work, made an idea like, how about a virtual Wednesday when we are connecting and counseling and supporting kids around academic behaviors and progress possible? It didn't just sprout out. It came from a series of seed ideas that had yielded success that then allow us to go to scale. One of my favorite examples in the spring, and I'm sure she is so tired of hearing me call her name, is Ms. Ford, who just went about her business teaching 5th grade math amazingly. And it started a seed that then led to that 5th grade math instruction being spread across her school, Cecil Elementary, and then across a network, and allowing other teachers to come in and support students in the small groups that we know they're often missing when they're disconnected. And I can say for my own children, I got a couple of learners at home for whom the virtual space and being able to check in and check out was fine, but when you get them in a small group, you get them in a one-on-one, they engage differently. So we started with that seedling and then landed in the summer with Ms. Ford working with colleagues, with other teachers, to say, now how do we take that seed of an idea and actually enable other teachers to build their capacity, to build their expertise, their experience? So this idea of a shift from individual genius to collective genius that is built on repeated innovations from seedling ideas. We're not waiting for the next smart person to raise their hand and get a crown. What we are in the process of doing is reshaping how we do the work so that then we can go and push on ideas that are outdated like seat time. But we can't do that unless we have the track record of successful innovation and scaling that up. Now, what's interesting about where we find ourselves right now, and I want to be real straight, is that this is not just about Baltimore or Baltimore City Public Schools where we find ourselves. Where we find ourselves now is at a point where we have an entire society, an entire nation asking the question about the value of school. And it is not a momentary one, and I've been saying, and Christy's tired of hearing me saying this, but we swim underwater in our own world, myself included. And sometimes we've got to come up above the water and actually see what's occurring across the ocean. And I'm here to tell you that I've peeked up above the water. And across the ocean, there is an opportunity and there is a choice. And I'm also here to tell you that if those McKinsey projections turn out to be true or worse, we are now in a context in our country where we may have mass numbers of people from every zip code. So don't get fixated on high-income learning pods. Families in every zip code are asking the question, do you care about my child? And do you care about my child enough to make sure that they learn even in the most challenging of circumstances? And ultimately, it is this question that we are poised to answer. And we are poised to answer with the seeds of innovation and success that our own city schools community has brought to the surface. So what I would say is that I started out talking about affirmation and the need for affirmation and the connection to being culturally responsive. And what we are also talking about is making sure that that families are seen, because fundamentally our interconnectedness relies on our ability to hold our children as everyone's. We've been saying it a lot. It's become catchphrase in a lot of education circles. But now we are at a point where our society is in a crucible and the heat is getting turned up. And so now the question becomes, how do we build a community where we signal, as Loretta Hammond says, in both action and deed, the value and the personhood of each member of Baltimore City, regardless of what the zip code is, what the race of the child is or the family, what the native language is. And so within this frame, one of the things that I remembered was a talk that I heard by David Brooks, who is a New York Times columnist and reporter. Not a reporter as much anymore, more a columnist. And a couple of years back, he started writing about this idea of community and the fact that across our country, we actually have an unraveling of connection. And how ironic that he would begin writing about that 2 or 3 years ago, long before we are actually experiencing a physical breaking down or distancing of community. And he talks about the fraying of connection, and he started an organization called Weave, it's Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And actually, for those of you who know Sarah Heminger, who is the founder of Thread, she's also part of that network. But it really is this idea of weave, is this idea that the social fabric of our nation and our communities is fundamentally rooted in our ability to connect with one another and to see one another in real ways, and then to act on those connections. So one more podcast for the morning, and it is David Brooks.
My favorite description of a community comes from Jane Jacobs. She was living the west side of New York City, and she's upstairs looking out over the street, and she sees a guy pulling a 9-year-old girl angrily. So she's about to go down to check out the situation, but as she's walking down, she notices the butcher has come out of his butcher shop. The lady at the fruit stand has come out into the street. The locksmith has come out into the street. And she writes, that guy didn't realize it, but he was surrounded. There were people there ready to act if he did anything wrong. And that's, to me, what community is. It's a bunch of people looking after each other, a bunch of people seeing each other and seeing each other deeply, taking the time to really enter into relationship with each other and to depend upon one another. And to me, the end result of all this is a sort of joyfulness. You can be happy alone. You win a game, you get a promotion, you feel big about yourself. Happiness is the expansion of self. But joy is the merger of self. It's the kind of thing that happens when you forget where you end and something else begins. When you really are seeing deeply into each other.
To be known deeply, to be seen, to be known deeply. It's interesting because I, during this pandemic, have, like a lot of parents, been concerned about my girls, because it's actually probably worse that they see me at home more. Everybody says, matter of fact, Xavier said to me today, the girls must be glad to have you home. And I said, actually, not so much. Because one of the things that they've said to me is, you're here, but you're not really here, because you're still working. And so I had to ponder that. And yes, I am starting the Working Mommy Support Group, so we'll make sure we get that going virtually. But what I did because of that was I started a practice of extended snuggle time. Now, keep in mind, my oldest is 14 and the twins are 11. But we started this practice during since the spring of extended snuggle time. And so what that looks like is, they come and they lay on the bed and they kind of, lay on my chest as big as they all are now. And during that time, one of the things I do, and not just because Zaretta Hammond wrote about it, was I try to spend that time affirming who they are far more deliberately than I did pre-pandemic. Because like everybody else, we get caught up in the gist of things and the swirl, and we do it when we can, but the pandemic has forced me, and frankly the racial unrest has forced me to be far more deliberate about it. And so what happens is, one of the girls, and they each have their individual time, because a lot of stuff is collective. I got 3, they're fairly close in age, and so a lot of stuff is collective. But this new iteration of snuggle time is actually individual by design. And so they come up and they'll lay on my chest, and I spend that time deliberately affirming who they are and speaking into what their purpose is. And so there was one night, one of them, I don't know if I should say who it is or she'll get me, was laying on my chest, and on this time, she heard, so actually I'll tell you, this one was Talia. And she heard this piece by David Brooks. And she said to me, Mommy, you have to use that. Because that's the picture of what it looks like when I get to snuggle with you. It's what it means to be wrapped in being safe and being able to be who you are. And then there was another snuggle time, this one with Franny, so just the twins. I had snuggle time with Kati, but she's a preteen, so I won't tell her snuggle time. And Franny came, and she had her snuggle time, and she laid on me, and she has felt this shutdown far more deeply. I should say, I think they've all felt it deeply, but hers has been more contemplative. And we were sitting there, and I had spent time, because she was worried about, will she actually have an in-person art class again? And we are blessed enough that, I've been ordering $100 worth of art supplies just so she can kind of continue to be affirmed in that way. And I spent time just reminding her of what her purpose is and what her gifts are. And I told her, you will do great things. You are absolutely talented. You can do things that Mommy can't. And I started telling our own little in-house stories about that. And she laughed. And then she said, sometimes it's hard when you have to work and we're at home. And I said, I know, baby. And I said, but you know how we just spent the last 15 minutes with me just reminding you of all your gifts and all your purpose and how special you are and how gifted you are? And she said, yeah. And I said, what's so deep about humanity and God's creation is that as special as I know you are, 79,000 other young people in Baltimore City are just as special as you are. And I don't get to have all of them crawl up next to me on our bed and have them lay like you're laying on me right now and tell them how deeply they are known. But that's why I work every day. Because every young person in Baltimore City, especially at this time, deserves somebody, at least one caring adult, who knows them deeply, who knows their promise, who knows their potential, who will not leave them, who will go out and run into the parking lot and get them a mask, who will call them the night before the advanced placement exam because they know it's the first time they've stepped out into a class that's been that hard. And so they call to make sure they're ready. To say, I know that this is what makes you special. And the power of God's creation is that as magnificent and brilliant and gifted and loved as Francesca Santelises is, every single young person in this city is just as special. That's the power of community. That's what it looks like. It looks like children who are not our own running out of the butcher shop, or in our context, the corner store, and saying, what's going on? Where are you? Do you need something else? Because that is what we need right now. That is community. That's the connection. And I just want you to know, when I said that to Franny, she was like, that's good. Okay. I hear you. And so part of the work that we have to do is actually showing our community what in some cases we actually have not shown them before. And that is that they are seen, they are known, and they are deeply, deeply cared for. So, with that, I officially open this year's first virtual CEO Leadership Academy. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to those of you out there who I did not get to name, but who are spreading the seeds, planting the seeds of collective genius that we can actually learn from and come out on the other side of this with stronger ties, stronger outcomes, and writing a different story than the one that McKinsey is predicting. What many of you know about me is part of my charge is proving people wrong. And I have great respect for all the analytics that McKinsey lifts. But the respect for those analytics does not in any way undermine my confidence and belief in the power of community and the power of connection. So thank you all. Have a fabulous CEO leadership. I want to thank everybody who continues to flood my inbox and others' inboxes with your great ideas. Know that they are seen and that they are read. And I want to thank you. Those of you who I know are approaching this work from the frame of the community building and the connection that needs to occur. And so let's begin our culturally relevant pedagogy discussions, because I will tell y'all, Dr. Durant cannot get to 170 plus schools. Just she and her staff of 2 or 3. That's not going to happen, not immediately. But as you wait for your turn through those development and learning experiences, let's practice culturally relevant pedagogy that is grounded in affirmation and grounded in connecting the affirmation for the kind of learning that we know young people need. Thank you. Have a great rest of the summer. Planning, I feel like summer is over. For those of you who have not had a break, you need to still scrap together a little semblance of time. I will tell you, I was reminded when I was away, martyrdom is a high, high bar. So take care of yourselves. This is a new venture and a new story, but we can do this. Thank you. Have a good one.